Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on Principles of Effective BIM Content Management. My name is Gary Sprague. I'm co-founder and CEO of Kinship, and today I'll be sharing 8 principles or strategies that you can follow to help ensure that you maximize the effort you put into your BIM content management. So before we get into the principles, just a little bit of background on myself. As I mentioned, I'm CEO and co-founder of Kinship. Kinship is a content management solution for teams working in Revit. It also provides project and team analytics. You can find us online at kinship.io. We've been running for about 5 years now, and Kinship is currently used by over 100 firms all over the world. So my talk today really draws from that experience of building a product and working closely with AEC firms to meet their content management needs. Prior to launching Kinship, our team was focused on Revit content creation. So in some form or another, I've been working with Revit content for over a decade now. And in my current role, I meet with multiple BIM teams every week. So I'm always in conversation with BIM managers, BIM coordinators, and others around their key needs, challenges, and goals related to content management, as well as their feedback on what we've built at Kinship. And then lastly, on both a personal level and as a team at Kinship, we're very passionate about usability and customer centricity. So we really focus on building a tool that's easy and convenient for people to use. We think that's incredibly important. And we really try and put the customer at the center of what we do in terms of listening to customer feedback, understanding, customer needs and the way that teams want to work in Revit and with their Revit content. We're going to talk about 8 principles for effective content management. And to start, I think it's important to give a quick definition of what we mean by effective content management. So from my perspective, there are about 5 things that are crucial to ensuring that your content management is effective. The first is that it has to help users find the right content quickly. I mean, that's really at the heart of any good content management system. If it doesn't help your team members get to the content they need as quickly as possible when they're working in projects, then it's really not doing its job. And at Kinship, we would say, that means being able to find what you need in a matter of seconds. The next thing is that it should help you maximize the value of that content. And that means ensuring content gets used across as many projects as possible, as consistently as possible, and that it helps you avoid, recreating content or redoing work on content as you move from project to project. The third thing I would highlight is that effective content management should not take up a lot of time, budget, or people resources in order to be used. So, content management is really something that's there to help you get the most value that you can out of your content and your work in BIM. And so it should be something that is not resource intensive. It should also facilitate continuous improvement. So that means it should help you, identify opportunities to improve and expand your content for your team and continue to meet your team's needs better and better over time. And then lastly, effective content management should be sustainable over the course of years. So this means it should be something that is easy to hand off as people move into and out of roles, and it should be able to keep up with evolving IT and Revit environments. Okay, so now let's get into the specific principles. So the first principle I want to talk about is that you should get a dedicated tool for content management. So it is certainly possible to manage content the old-fashioned way through network drives, file folders, and Windows Explorer, maybe in combination with some spreadsheets and documentation to help you reference and track that content. But at the end of the day, I think you'll find that if you want to fulfill that definition of effective content management and be able to meet the other principles that we're going to cover today, you'll need a dedicated tool for that really offers, the features and functionality that are particular to BIM content. And I would just encourage everyone to look at that as an investment rather than an expense, because it is something that will help you maximize the value of your content and of your overall work in BIM. The second principle I want to highlight is that keeping things simple and easy facilitates adoption. So, here what we're talking about is essentially usability. In order for people to use a content management system, it has to be something that is relatively simple and easy for them to figure out and adopt. And so another way to look at this is, you want to avoid the temptation of trying to find a tool or a system that can do absolutely everything you might imagine you want to do with content management, and instead focus on finding something that does the key things you need as simply and easily as possible, because that's what's going to ensure that it actually gets used as much as possible across your team. The third principle is don't wait until your library is ready. So this is something that I come across sometimes when I'm talking to BIM teams, a situation where a firm doesn't yet have a library in place and people want to wait until they have that content library finished before they put a content management tool, content management system in place for the team. It's understandable why people want to do that. They want to have their content ready before they have a tool that helps them get that content to their team members. But there are a couple counterpoints I think that are important to keep in mind. The first is that your library is really always going to be a work in progress. It's never going to cover every single need that might come up and be totally comprehensive. There's always going to be stuff that needs updating and improving. And so I've seen, firms fall into the trap of waiting until their library is ready, and they think that might take a couple months, and that turns into 6 months, turns into a year plus. And in the meantime, everyone is stuck doing things the old-fashioned way, and you're not getting any of the kind of insights and advantages that come with having a dedicated tool. The second point to keep in mind is that a good content management tool should also help you get your library ready. So it's not just something that should be there for when you have kind of the finished product and need to distribute it out to your team. An effective content management system should also help you with that development process of gathering content, reviewing it, triaging it, updating it, and organizing it for the team. Okay, the next principle I want to talk about is leveraging your existing sources of content. So you may not have any content management system in place, you may not have any content library in place for the team, and yet your team has been working in BIM and delivering projects for some time. And that means they've found ways to get content that they need and get it into projects to get those projects delivered. So it could be content that they've created, it could be out-of-the-box content that they've adapted, it could be content that they've downloaded from different publishers, manufacturers, etc. And I think an effective content management system will help you tap into that to build and improve your library. So, it might not all be great content, but there can certainly be some gems in there, or content that maybe with just a bit of updating, cleanup, improvement can be very usable. And even if you don't want to use any of that content in your future library, it can still, looking at those sources of content can still help you identify what types of content, what particular pieces of content you want to have in that library to meet the needs of your team and projects. The fifth principle I want to talk about is having dedicated spaces for non-standard content. So, your focus with content management is probably going to be your, main company library, the standard set of content that you want the team to be using across as many projects as possible. But inevitably, there will be other types of content that you need to deal with. Some examples here would be like project-specific content, client-specific content, content that's in development or needs to be reviewed, or maybe third-party content like manufacturer libraries that aren't built to your standards, aren't built by you, but you do want to take advantage of from time to time. So an effective content management system will give you a way to manage that outside of your library. So, of course, you don't want to just have to mix that content into your main library where it will be difficult to keep track of and tell apart, and where it's likely to end up getting used in places where it shouldn't. At the same time, you don't want to have to keep it outside of your content management system where it takes extra time and effort to manage, and where you won't be able to take advantage of the features and functionality that come with your content management system. So again, in order to have an effective content management system, you want to be able to keep these types of content these non-standard sets of content as part of your system, but you also want to be able to keep them separate from your main library so you can manage them in the particular ways that you need to. Okay, principle number 6 is that clear and natural naming works best. And here we're really talking about how you name the content that you're managing. So again, thinking back to the traditional way of managing content through a file system, you really had to rely on a file name to tell you what it is you were looking at or what it is that was inside of that file. And that would frequently lead to firms using very long and or complicated naming conventions, so using a lot of like codes, abbreviations, acronyms to try and squeeze as much information as possible into a file name. As you move to having a dedicated content management tool, you should be able to tap into other data that's part of your content to help people manage and find it. So things like when you're talking about Revit content, the parameter data, or it could also be things like tags or other kind of groupings that you put your content into to help organize it for the team. And this means that you don't need to rely on the name of something to tell you everything about it. And instead, you can move to having more clear, natural naming that doesn't take a lot of time to figure out and doesn't leave a lot of room for misinterpretation. So what we're really talking about here is lightening the cognitive load for your team when they're looking at content in your system, making it as easy as possible for them to tell what it is they're looking at, and then using other data that's part of the content, part of your content management system to help them get more specific about what they might want to use. Okay, principle number 7 is that searchability trumps classification. So again, thinking back to the old school way of using Windows file system to manage content, aside from a file name, the other thing that you could use to help people find things was a folder structure. And so a lot of thought and care would be put into coming up with a classification system, a folder structure that would help people drill down, level by level to find the right particular object that they need. As you move to having a dedicated content management tool, you want to look for a tool or a system that's as searchable as possible. And the reason is that not everyone thinks of content in the same way. Not everyone uses the same kind of mental model to think about how content is defined or classified. And within a classification system, it's always possible, to make the wrong choice as you kind of move through those levels of the classification, and then it takes extra time, extra effort to, find what it is you're looking for. So when you have a system that's highly searchable, you're basically making your content as accessible to, as many team members as possible with as many different ways as they might have for thinking about that content. As many different kind of pieces of criteria that they might use to find and select what they need. So the more searchable your system, the more accessible and flexible it will be to meet the needs of all of your team members, regardless of how they think about the content. And then our final principle is that you should be able to keep track of what's being used. So you might have the best content library in the world, the best content library your team has ever seen. But if you're not sure or you can't tell how that content is actually being used in your projects by your team members, then you're really not going to be able to get the full value out of it, maximize the value of it over time. So here we're really talking about connecting the dots between your content management and your projects. And this is things like which projects is content being used on, what content is being used the most, is it being modified within projects, what kinds of modifications are happening. Those insights are really critical to being able to fulfill that piece of the definition of effective content management of continuous improvement. So if you want to be able to keep improving your content library, improving the content that you have, expanding it to meet more needs, then you really need to be able to see how the content you have is being used right now on your projects. So those are our 8 principles of effective BIM content management. We can quickly review them here. So number 1 was to get a dedicated tool. It's worth the investment to have a tool that is really focused on BIM content management and gives you the features and functionality that will let you make the most of that. The second is that keeping things simple and easy facilitates adoption. So, try to find a tool or a system that makes things as easy, as convenient as possible for both managers and users to make use of, because that's going to be what ensures that your content management has the maximum impact, gets used the most across your team. The third principle was to not wait until your library is ready. So first, remembering that your library may never be a totally finished product, and so if you wait until you think it's totally ready, you may end up waiting a really long time. And the right content management tool should help you in that process of getting the library ready and help your team make the most of whatever content you already have available in the meantime. Our fourth principle was to leverage your existing sources of content. So tap into your existing project content, existing user content to either find good candidates for your content library and populate your library with things that are already being used that are suitable, or at a minimum, identify the types of content that you want to have in your library if you're developing content from scratch. The fifth principle is to have dedicated spaces for non-standard content, so ensuring you have a way to manage things like project-specific content, content that's in development, or third-party content that you want to use on projects, and manage that outside of your library, but within your content management system for the particular team members and projects that need to have access to it. The sixth principle was that clear and natural naming works best, so taking advantage of the additional data that a content management tool will give you and your team access to not rely on just a naming convention for people to find what they need, and therefore being able to use simpler, more natural naming for your content to make it easy for people to tell what they're looking at and avoid misinterpretations. Our seventh principle was that searchability is better than classification. So classification is fine. You'll end up having some classification, in a content management system, no matter what. But you want to look for something that is also highly searchable, so that you can be sure, different team members with different ways of thinking about your content, different criteria for defining the content they're looking for, will all be able to get to the content they need. And lastly, being able to keep track of what's being used. So again, connecting the dots between your content and your projects to see how your content library ends up being applied within your projects, and being able to get insights into opportunities to keep improving that over time. So those are our 8 principles of effective BIM content management, and I look forward to answering your questions either on these 8 principles or anything else related to the topic of BIM content management. Thanks so much.